So welcome to what we think is the 10th Proust podcast. That means that we've hit double figures. I think we should have some kind of celebration from aghast though we may be that is still the case. And I'm really excited. I've been looking forward to this chat for quite some time. We're talking today to Mark Berry, who's a name that some of you may know, some of you have had contact with. Certainly Mark and I have kind of moved in similar circles and had mutual friends and bumped into each other in all sorts of things for probably 20 years, Mark. It must be getting towards that now.
Can't be that long, surely.
Well, obviously, I was only 14 when it all started. It's quite some time. And the problem we're going to have today, I think, is there's so many different things that we could talk about that are relevant to the journey that we're trying to make around thinking about Proust and what Proust may become. And also the kind of interactions with various ways of trying to do faith in a way that is meaningful. So I guess what we're going to try and do is sort of have a sort of disciplined but free chat about some of that. And, whether it is disciplined enough, and we run out of time, because I think we're saying we're going to try and keep it to somewhere near an hour. But if we run on to about an hour 20, is that still okay with you? And but we will absolutely guillotine it at that. And if necessary, we can always invite you back again. You may say no, but we can invite you back again.
Yes.
So I'm going to hand over to our Rob, who's going to ask you stuff.
Thank you, Chris. Rob. Thank you, Chris, and again, thank you, Mark, for sparing us some of your time. I was just thinking you could edit in, if you were some sort of celebratory noises when it's the 10th episode.
You think that I've got those skills?
Well, this is coming from the person who couldn't get the microphone to work for
exactly.
At least the 10th time.
Yeah.
So that would be fun. Anyway, Mark, thank you ever so much. Because all good professional interviewers do this, they do a little bit of research, don't they? And as I'm none of those, I did happen to look at your website, and you do a heck of a lot. Yeah, you do a heck of a lot of stuff. So can you, for the sake of the listener, can you just tell us, give us a quick resume of your career so far?
Oh, gosh. Going back a long time, I trained as a lighting designer and worked as a lighting designer in the theatre and the music industry for a few years. That's going back a long time, but always been in the arts, went to art school, always been involved in the arts through that. But then in the mid-90s, when the recession hit and the theatre and the music industry just bombed for a while, I was doing a lot of voluntary youth work. So I took the opportunity to train as a youth worker and a youth minister. And so that's where I started, really, in terms of ministry, was working with young people who were largely outside of the church, whether that be schools or just out in the community. I spent, in my formative years as a youth minister, spent a couple of years hanging out and living with a bunch of neo-Nazi skinheads in South London, which kind of set some of the tone for my ministry and my life ever since. I've always kind of lived and engaged in life with people who don't really fit in places or in communities that sort of have their own sense of identity and struggle. So, yeah, do a lot of all sorts of things, really. I'm a pioneer minister. I was one of the first to be licensed as a lay pioneer. I just do loads of stuff: poetry, art, football, prisons, you name it, whatever I can do, whatever I can explore and experiment with.
So thank you. Do you have a typical day? What's a typical day of a lay pioneer?
No such thing.
What does that mean to the uninitiated, to be a lay pioneer?
Well, the lay part means I'm not ordained, and that's something that I've struggled with and fought for many years, not to be ordained, and managed to. It's one of the few successes in my life is that I've successfully avoided being ordained, I think. So the lay part is that I'm not ordained. The pioneer part, I guess, somebody You started as a pioneer when we were really starting to use that word. I came through alternative worship, emerging church, all of that stuff, which is where Chris and I first encountered each other at Greenbelt, and we worked together a couple of times. One time particularly doing it was supposed to be 24 hours, but I think it was about 12 hours of a worship event in New Forms at Greenbelt. But as a pioneer, I guess it's I'm an entrepreneur. Not in terms of making money, but it's about seeing opportunity to connect and engage with people and just going with the flow and seeing what comes up, really. So no, there really isn't a typical day. At the moment, I could be in prison, I could be in London, I could be doing stuff with the Church of England, I could be hanging out talking to people. It can be all sorts of things, really.
Can I ask them a very, very practical question? Are you employed by the Church of England?
For a couple of days a month.
Okay.
Just for a couple of days a month, yeah.
When you call yourself a pioneer, is that a title that's given to you, or one you give to yourself? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be intrusive, but I'm just really interested in trying to understand what this all means.
Well, if I go back to the early 2000s, when I was working as a youth minister, working with a bunch of different churches, exploring various different things. I think I was just beginning to explore the late 90s, early 2000s stuff around new monasticism and thinking about faith in a different way. As I mentioned, when I started in my youth ministry, I always seemed to gravitate or find myself with people who were, for want of a better phrase, on the margins of society. I'd want to challenge that phrase these days, but people know what I mean when I say that.
Yeah.
It came to a point in my youth ministry. We worked for a few different churches, groups of churches, and I guess I had a choice, really. One was to keep doing that and to sort of move into ever bigger churches or youth work organisations. And another choice was to go into an office job with a diocese or something. But that just wasn't me. I like going into new places and meeting new people and doing new things. I'm not one for routines. And I was really, wondering what to do and where to go. And I think at about the same time, the Church of England started to use this word pioneer in terms of thinking about ministers and missionaries, in inverted commas, that went into new places. I think it came out in part of the Mission Shaped Church report, thinking about how do we do things differently. Yeah. And so there was a little bit of there was an emphasis at that point of saying, well, we need people, they recognized that church attendances were not growing, that there were increasing numbers of de-church people, but I think it was George Barna's research at that point showed that the biggest group of people that there were those who had never been to church, the completely unchurched.
Yeah.
And so I think there was some energy at that point in saying, well, we need to go to new places and go and be with people, whether it's networks, whether it's communities, whatever that is. And so the term pioneer was used. So it was one that I think I was exploring myself. But yes, when I moved to Telford in 2005, that was my job title.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. So what's your background with Proust? Did you get involved with Proust in its earlier iterations?
Yes. I think it was about 2006, 2007. I wrote a pocket liturgy book.
Right.
Which was built around our patron saint in our little community here in Telford, who was St. Brendan the Navigator, which is the theme of which is all about stepping into the unknown and taking risks and setting off beyond the horizon without any maps and charts and, setting sail, basically.
Okay.
So I wrote a collection of liturgies that we were using in our communities, compiled that, put some new stuff together, and did a little pocket liturgy book called Navigatio.
Right.
I'd forgotten about that, of course.
Yeah, and I think, I also did, going back, I did some did an EP, I think, with sort of ambient music and meditations and stuff like that, ambient dance music and things. So one of my sort of early attempts at doing EDM.
Oh, yeah, we've got it. Just so you know,
Yes,
that was one of those that Andy Freeman sent through. So we have got a copy of that one in sort of PDF type form. Okay, well that's really helpful. I mean, I think that's a great introduction, and I wouldn't want to stretch that out. I'd rather get into what we really want to talk about, which is the whole thing about art and spirituality, which Chris tells me that I believe you teach.
Well,
oh, okay, all right then.
I've taught all sorts of things over the years. I'm one of those people who gets things thrown at them. Can you teach this? It's like, yeah, I'll give that a go. And I've taught a lot around culture. So I've taught quite a bit on cultural exegesis and understanding culture and the role of culture in how we're shaped as people and how that affects faith and spirituality, how we listen to culture and understand myths, legends, narratives that are going on with culture. And as someone who's always grown up around art, as I mentioned, I went to art school and then trained as a theatre designer and then a lighting designer. Art, music, theatre, the arts as a whole has always been part of my exploration and my expression of spirituality. And a few years ago, I came across, in fact, well, quite a long time ago now, probably 20 years ago, I came across the concept of poiesis and began to explore that as in terms of spirituality and philosophy. And what that meant for me as someone who was a creative, and how I did my spirituality and how I did my faith.
Mark, I'm going to have to interrupt you for the sake of the listener. What's poiesis?
Well, it's a philosophical term, and there's lots of different layers on it, but it's spelled Poiesis, and it's the root from where we get words like poetry and so on. And it's about making meaning. Well, it's less about making meaning and more about uncovering meaning. Okay. So one of the concepts, the philosophical concepts of poiesis, is that all is present, and yet we only understand and encounter a part of that. And poiesis is about bringing that meaning, bringing that truth, bringing that beauty into our sphere, if you like. And all of the struggle and wrench that goes with that. I think, I can't remember which sculptor, whether it was Rodin, who, when he talked about sculpture, said that the role of the sculptor was to chip away the bits of unnecessarily marble until the figure that was living within the marble appeared. Oh. And so poiesis is in some sense that idea that, there is all there, and our role is to keep uncovering more of it and bringing it into the sphere of human experience. So it's creativity, but it's not creativity that comes necessarily from within or from my skill as an artist. It's about bringing forth the meaning that is there and the beauty that is there around us, but hidden from us, perhaps.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Carry on.
It does. I'm sort of intrigued by this for its connection to all sorts of things, but I suppose our conversation began around some of these things when I think you posted something on Facebook that had that referenced that Rodin quote, and some other pithy kind of issues around poiesis, and then we kind of began corresponding about that, and it felt that at the time Rob and I and others were scratching our heads and thinking about, well, if we do start a Proust thing again, what's it for? And what's the point of it? What's the guiding principles we would seek to engage with? And what theology is relevant to that discussion? And I guess it felt at the time really difficult to separate in our minds what Proust was and the context that it was birthed into, both in terms of its point in history, but also in terms of the debates that were happening at the time around emerging church, around alternative worship, especially around alternative worship. And fundamentally, the core of what Proust was about trying to do cool worship, wasn't it? You know, I know that I don't want to be totally pejorative in the way I say that, but it was trying to find ways of making what had become empty full and meaningful and relevant and arising from communities, arising from the depths of who we are. So from what you're saying, the kind of the poesis idea, the poetic idea, was a huge part of that from the outset for you.
Yeah, I think the idea of beauty as part of that, and beauty not solely in a kind of romantic sense, but the beauty of struggle, the beauty of creativity, the beauty of pain, the beauty of grief, of struggle, of all of that. I think that was always a part, I think, for me, of what alternative worship was trying to do, was trying to find ways to express and encounter beauty. And that wasn't always easy. And, I remember talking with Pete Rollins about some of the stuff they were doing over in Belfast, about that it was not comfortable. The uncovering of beauty was not comfortable. I remember, actually, slight story, I remember that one moment with Pete in Belfast, and I think it was about 2006, actually, because it was quite late on, and we went over, myself and one of our community went over to do a pilgrimage, to do a St. Brendan pilgrimage, and we also managed to hook up with Pete in Belfast, and we went on a little tour of Belfast as part of their worship. It was a coach trip, and we stopped at one point where they first met. And it was this really, it's an alleyway basically to this place, and it was a brick. And as we were stood there, and Pete and Padraig were talking and leading us and stuff, I happened to notice some graffiti on the wall opposite, and it was the word God with a red circle around it and a red line crossing it out, and it just felt so beautiful that in that place in Belfast where the religion had become such a thing of division, and there was this story of Icon and wrestling with all of that, and there on the wall was this sort of God with a red line crossed out, and it just felt like a really beautiful moment. And it wasn't beauty, and it was always not that pretty. It was kind of like it made manifest all of that struggle in one word and a symbol, and to me that was a thing of beauty. The way it was spray painted onto the wall just said so much about that culture in just a really simple icon, no pun intended.
Yes.
And so there's something about that which, for me, alternative worship was part of people of my, I guess, my peers, myself, trying to wrestle and uncover a sense of beauty within spirituality and within worship. That had all of that truth in it. You know, it wasn't necessarily pretty, but it was raw, and it was beautiful.
Wow, yeah. For those listeners that haven't heard of Pete Rollins, then I guess Pete and Padraig were part of a group called Icon that were, I suppose, part philosophy, part faith, part provocateurs. I remember once one of their events at Greenbelt had a whole series of protesters outside waving placards, warning people about these people being heretics. And then, those of us that shuffled past to get into the, then we realized that the people doing the protesting were the Icon themselves outside their own event. It's that trickster, the element of trying to subvert in order to make us go deeper and think deeper. Yes, amazing stuff.
So it's a setup, you mean?
Yeah. Well, you might say it was a setup. You might say that was the point, though. The point of the thing was to make us think about the business of heresy. I think Pete's idea is this idea that whatever we think, well, it's not his idea. It's the philosophical idea that what we think we know about God, we have to accept we don't know. So anything that we hold, we have to hold at least lightly. So anyway. Again, we're in danger of spinning off into all sorts of other chats. But that's not to say don't speak, Mark. Please go on. Let's spin off.
There was one. I just wanted to. It was memories coming back. one moment which I thought was incredible and provocative and just blew my mind, I have to say, at an Icon event at Greenbelt, where they had people, I think there were 3 or 4 people reading poetry, spiritual poetry. And there was a lady, a youngish lady, and I remember she was stood on if I remember this correctly, stood on a milk crate to the microphone and was reading this beautiful poetry about that God is the Trinity and harmony, very kind of Tolkien-esque really, about the almost the divine as a chord, and talking about all this harmony, and it was so beautiful. And then gradually what happened is her voice was crossfaded with the original, with the person who actually said it. And as it crossfaded, you became aware of this male voice. And then you became aware it was a male voice from Northern Ireland. And then you became aware that it was Ian Paisley.
Oh, my word.
And the moment that you kind of cottoned on that this was this figure who we've grown up with, who spoke so angrily and so aggressively, speaking these beautiful words, it just was this jar that made you think, wow, you know, and that was the provocative sense. It wasn't mindlessly provocative. It was meaning to kind of really get you to think and to catch you unawares with your own preconceptions and ideas, and challenge them and push them. It was very, I mean, Pete was a big fan of Zizek, and I think that really sort of pushed you into that place of challenging your thinking. And for me, that's something of where poesis is, because it's being willing to kind of let go of the ability to construct and uncover something that's not new, but is perhaps new to you, new, and there's a risk in that, which I really love. And I think, you know, there's just going back to the poesis thing, the Genesis story, the creation narrative. There's a wonderful thing in that which I think I missed for years and years and years. And I think, you know, grew up in a sense with the idea of God, the divine, as a mechanic, a constructor, a scientist, if you like. But particularly this mechanic, you know, who knew God's skill and was able to construct and so on. And yet there is this phrase that's repeated, I think, 7 times in the Genesis narrative, the creation narrative. And it is this: God looked at it and saw that it was good. Right. That phrase to me is really, that's one of those phrases that just jars and sends, you know, into this new place of thinking, because when you start to think about that phrase, then it challenged me with my whole way of thinking about the divine, because I guess I've been brought up with this idea, you know, that God was infallible and, you know, God knew everything and omnicompetent and all of that. But creation wasn't an act of competence then. Creation was an act of art, because for God to look back at what had been created and say it is good, therefore to me suggests that there was a possibility that God could look at creation and go, that's crap. Yeah. That's not good. So there's a risk moment in there that God made themselves vulnerable in the act of creation. And it's that repeated phrase, which I just love, and God looked at it and saw that it was good. To me, is like, it makes me feel like, or the image it conjures up in me is there's 2 images really. One is the artist who's, you know, caught up in this, making this piece of art, and then steps back and looks at it and goes, actually, it is good. And the other is the mother, you know, the moment of birth, that you know, the baby is born, and the first thing that happens is everyone looks at it and goes, is it good? Is it whole? Is it healthy? Yeah. Yes, it is. Or, you know, but I think that moment of that sense of the artistic tension of risk that there is in creativity, I think that's there in creation. It has to be for me. But that to me changes my understanding of God.
That's really interesting. I like that.
From the way you're describing this then, Mark, I'm hearing poesis as a process and a tool, but I'm also wondering if it's more of an event. It's something, it's a happening that that is tangible in the moment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does the question even make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it's. I mean, Heidegger talks about it as being a comportment toward being. It's the bringing out of being. So it is an event. Yes, it's both process and event, an uncovering, a bringing forth, a bringing towards presence and being. It's I'm not a philosopher, so I struggle with it, but I get excited about that idea. I mean, Derek Whitehead talks about, uses the idea of, which you will like, Chris, of the potter. You know, he says a pot is brought forth or led into being from the clay on the wheel. And therefore we can speak about a pot's thrownness, about how it has been brought forward. And yet we cannot know it until it is brought forward, until it is actually finally brought forward. Then it takes on its own identity and its meaning. So there's this kind of a formative intentionality in bringing that forward, and the process is part of it because the process shapes it. But then there's also this sense that it exists, and it's the process that brings brings it forward. Yeah. And the other example that's often used is the idea of a wooden cup that exists within the trunk of a tree. And the cup maker brings it out. So that sense of the aesthetic within that, and I think the creation with that sense of God saying, looking at it and saying, God looked in and saw it was good. Brings the aesthetic, makes creation an aesthetic process.
Right.
So, from that point of view, is there almost like an instruction to live out poesis, to seek after poesis, to kind of to find that wooden cup inside the tree, or whatever analogy we want to use, the pottery one? Is that intrinsic to our tradition, to our Christian tradition? Do you think? Is it? I mean, is that something that you can see emerging through the story of Scripture?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's. I wouldn't want to attribute it to a tradition. I think it's about human expression. It's about being fully human. Where I want to say, if we understand God, the divine within this kind of framework, the creative, the relational, the vulnerable, the risk taking, then there's something about, as humans, but not just as humans, but actually, is this part of the narrative of the whole of creation, that we're made in that image of vulnerability and creativity and aesthetic and all of that? I mean, I can't see how it's not. So in a sense, I don't want to say, well, look, this is a Christian idea, because it isn't. But for me, when I look at look at my faith, look at Scripture, look at the narrative through the eyes of the aesthetic, the eyes of the poet, of the potter, of the artist, then actually I find that Scripture takes on more depth, more meaning, more beauty in a sense. It ceases to become cerebral and becomes truly aesthetic. It becomes a thing of beauty, and therefore, when we get lost in a literature kind of way of looking at it, constructive and all of that, we lose some of that because we begin to debate the finer points without seeing story and beauty and the grand sweep of Scripture. What I once got asked. When I was working for the Church Mission Society, and they have their annual training, and I think with a slight smirk on his face, I think it was Paul Thaxter, who was then the director of mission, said to me, well, could you do a session on mission in the Bible? I'm like, yeah, okay, I can do a session on mission in the Bible. He said, great, you've got an hour. So I've got to do teach mission in the Bible in an hour. And so the only way to do that was to step away. It was a bit like those Magic Eye, the old Magic Eye 3D things.
Oh yeah.
I could never see them.
Nah.
Well, I learned how to see them, but and I love them because of that, because I can do it. It's great, and it always makes me feel nice. It's like people who can do the Rubik's Cube. I hate the Rubik's Cube because I can't do it. But yeah, you almost had to then step to look through Scripture. So not to look at Scripture, but to look through it, like you're looking at a magic eye, almost to defocus and see what is there within it, behind it, and see, so for me, as I began to do that with Scripture, what I began to see was a line that went through Scripture, which was about, to use the theological term, shalom, was about the whole sense of the harmony and narrative of creation that runs all the way through Scripture. The image of the tree, that goes through, the sense that it goes right from Genesis through into Revelation and actually carries through in this really clear line that you can only see when you step back and defocus, in a sense. If that makes sense.
Yes, that sounds very Celtic spirituality to me, Mark. That's just right to my heart. I like that. Yeah. Okie dokie. Well, it might be worth mentioning, one of the other things that we had interacted about was the relationship that I kind of thought may be relevant between the poesis idea and this kind of school of thought that is using the label theopoetics. Can't even say that very easily. Which my understanding is very much to do with a group of people that are using the making process. So poetics actually means to make. So almost I suppose you're describing a process of making God in that idea of theopoetics. But which probably goes back quite neatly to Peter Rollins as kind of themes in How Not to Speak of God, and this idea that we are constructing an idea of who God is, and we're doing that in big ways, with big theologies, and we're doing it with small theologies, and we're doing that in the making of art. So there's a lot there about embodiment and vulnerability and being and justice, and how being connected to people who are normally excluded, is a way of reconnecting us with the true meaning of some of the stuff that we've kind of got lost from. So I think there's lots of parallels there that are quite fascinating. Do you remember that chat, Mark? Am I doing just do it? I don't know whether I am or not.
Well, Rob, when you at the beginning you asked about whether you said, you teach this, and I didn't really sort of get around. I sort of laughed it off in a way, but I was asked to teach a module for Cuddesdon on practical theology, practical and reflective theology. And I wanted to throw in a session on poesis, because for me, that sense of the act of poesis, or the act of creating, of making, it is a theological reflection. And I think there's something intrinsically human about narrative, and about whether that's a linguistic, whether that's poetry, story, whether it's drawing, art, making of symbolic stuff. I mean, all of that is about kind of a process of reflecting on divinity and on God. So I wanted to bring in a session on that, which was kind of, and I sort of wrestled and searched for stuff, and there's quite a lot of bits and pieces, but not a lot of really that people spend a lot of time sort of bringing it together and forming it. And I think, that sense of, the earliest things we did to express our reflection was to make art, was to chip at a bit of bone, was to paint on a wall, was to blow paint across a hand, was to tell folk tales and stories of the stars in the sky, and and the rivers and the animals, the fables and the myths and the legends. That was the earliest thing that we did. And I think post-Enlightenment, we lost some of that sense of making meaning and actually uncovering meaning through the making of art, whatever that is. So, and I think for me, well, it's just, but I don't like to call myself a poet because I don't like labels, and I don't like to define myself in that way because it feels arrogant and makes me feel rubbish. But yeah, a few years ago, we were leading up to Advent in our community. Advent is probably our key season of the year. The whole thing of expectation and promise and vulnerability and all of that. And so I decided I wanted to write. I wanted to do something that I couldn't do. And I grew up being able to draw, and was told all the way through my education, "Oh, you can't write. You don't do words." And I struggled with essays, and I struggled with all of that because I don't do words. So, but I can draw. So I came to this sort of with an option. I thought, well, I can make art, I can draw, I can do prints, I can do all of that, and I can explore the story through that. But I know how to do that. I can bring my competence and my skill to bear in doing that. Well, that's not going to take me anywhere new.
Right.
So I made the decision, I'm going to write some poetry. In my, what I must have been, I don't know, 50, I don't know how old I was when I did it, but it was like, okay, let's do something that I can't do. Let's do something that I'm not competent at. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write 4 poems, one for each Sunday in Advent. By the time we got to Christmas, I'd written 70 poems.
Wow.
And it was an amazing experience, not because they're any good. And I think people that have, used them and heard them and read them, and I've used them for stuff myself, it's not that I'm competent at it, but because I'm doing something where I can't rely on my competence, I'm having to let go and actually just dwell in what I'm doing and allow that to speak and not try and construct it or hone it or whatever. And I've got friends, a good friend of mine, really good friend of mine, she's a poet, and she's always encouraging me to edit. And I feel scared of editing because that's where I might have to bring competence or more likely incompetence to bear. So I just wanted to actually explore that process of being in that narrative or being in that place and reflection. So that for me, the theopoetic side of stuff is, and it's not something I really understand, it's something I'm exploring, is saying, well, can we encounter something of the divine that is outside of our competence, outside of our understanding? Is there stuff? Well, no, not is there stuff. I know there's stuff that about God and about the universe that is way beyond my comprehension and my ability to understand it. So I've got to find another way to engage with that if I want to. I'll let the theologians and the philosophers and the wordy people do all of that stuff. I just want to throw stuff at a piece of paper and see what comes out of that and what actually reveals itself to me. So that process of creating is part of that.
I mean, that's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something about, obviously for me, poetry that enables us to connect with stuff that we don't quite know about, that yet it's still within us, which is fascinating. I'm also going back, if we may, slightly to that question I asked about whether or not we're describing an event or a process, because I'm wondering if there's also a connection here to the mystical. Because for me, I started off in my church worshipping life in my career, I suppose you might even say, standing up front with a guitar and leading people to sing soft rock love songs to Jesus, and I say that with a lot of kind of cringe as I look back on some of that, but there's some things about what I look back on that I have never quite been able to experience doing anything else. There's moments. I mean, I was at the time, I suppose, involved in fairly charismatic circles, and that moment when you feel there's almost like a crackle in the middle of everything, and you almost hear like suddenly, that sound when you used to switch something from mono to stereo, and something opens up, and we can spend a long time trying to analyze what that was, but what I see that now as is the same thing that I feel when I read a poem and it breaks me open, or when I'm in a space and I can't quite understand why I'm moved by the curve of the arches that I'm under, or when I make a pot and suddenly something's emerged that I'm really pleased with. That last one is harder for me because that, I suppose, the pottery is still in the same way that's me doing something that is beyond my comfort zone still. So I'm just, I think there's something in there about poesis being a mystical experience. Is that something you resonate with as well?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and I mean, I think the mystical experience is about being willing to dwell in the unknown, but also almost with a sense of not desiring to know. You know, Merton talked about in his essay about a message to poets. He said, "Let us be proud of the words that are given to us for nothing, not to teach anyone, not to confute anyone, not to prove anyone absurd, but to point beyond all objects into the silence where nothing can be said." And I think that for me is a kind of sense of the mystical, which is, you know, it's not for me to be able to go, I'm not doing this to construct something, I'm doing this just to be in that process. And so the mystical sense is that it's not, I'm not taking apart an engine to be able to understand how it works. You know, I don't need to understand the process. All I need to do is to be willing to enter into it and actually see where it leads me. And it might not lead me anywhere, and that's okay, because that is itself a beautiful thing, the process of just being in that. So I don't know. I mean, you know, again, we tend to sort of associate the mystics with words and being very clever and confusing and all of that. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess the mystical sense is to be okay with the unknown and to be able to engage with the unknown in a kind of relational way. And to be comfortable with that. I guess, I don't know. It's you've probably got more of a sense of what a mystic is than I have, Chris.
I don't know if that's true at all. But I suppose the other bit of this then is the relationship between spirituality and art. And you might say, I suppose, with the particularly looking back at Proust, the first iteration, as Rob just said, worship and art.
Yeah.
And it felt a lot of the time, the church tries to employ art as a weapon to achieve certain goals. Whereas we talk about spirituality and art and its relationship, it's a very different kind of conversation.
I guess, religious art was about conveying a message, to some extent. And yet, I think we're of a generation that comes off the coattails of an incredible shift in art, in the history of art, post-war. Well, even before that, with the Dadaists and the Surrealists and the abstract artists, the sense of doing art for art's sake. And, I was talking with somebody only today about the commercial artist and the place of the commercial artist and the place of the free artist, or if you like, the expressive, the fine artist. And I don't want to get into, I'm not making value judgments, but I think there's a difference between, the church that uses art, stained glass windows, paintings, the Renaissance stuff, to tell its story in the way that it wants the story to be told, and the place of art as a way of uncovering meaning. So I think about, Jackson Pollock is the classic example, who wanted to see what would emerge from a process, and he would construct processes that were encouraging randomness to see what might emerge, and to allow beauty to kind of come forth. And sometimes it doesn't work. or at least sometimes it doesn't bring about the expected result.
Okay.
But the process itself is creating the space for that to that possibility, that potential to be there. So I think there was something about growing up in that kind of culture where within the church we'd moved from the sort of Renaissance and all of that, and this religious art, through the kind of iconoclasm of Reformation and I was going to dates all bottled up, but you know what I mean. And we were still very much, I think, in the 70s and 80s in a kind of iconoclastic phase where we didn't want to have images. The images were illustrative, you know.
In the Protestant tradition, certainly.
Very much, yeah. In my, you know, and yet. And uncovering the sense of an icon, which is something through, you know, a window by which we view the divine, rather than a representation of the divine. Yes, you know, so so if art could be iconography in that sense, if music, painting, poetry could be a way which we could look through and encounter a new sense of the divine. Or a new encounter with the divine, then the process itself could also be that. And that's where I think Pollock and people like that were trying to do, and say, well, the process is part of it. And once the process is finished, the artist releases it. And it becomes something new for somebody else. I'm just aware that I'm getting very dark here, and if we're filming, do you want me to turn a light on?
Well, you could do that, but we can still see you. It's probably just the light of your laptop.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Can I just pitch in? I think that's really interesting because you commented, Mark, about, you know, the idea of story and myth and fable kind of got dismissed after the Enlightenment, where we all decided that science was everything and you needed knowledge and fact and all this. And I think for me, and in the language you're speaking, we're still in that place in a lot of ways, aren't we?
Yeah.
That whether, you know, just people in general daren't explore the things that they're told they aren't any good at. So in your experience, it was, okay, I can draw, but I can't write. And I think one of the dangers of modern society has been that people get stuck. You specialize in something. From a very, very early age, people are trained to specialize in something and never be a generalist in anything. So it means that you realize at a very early age you're good at, let's say, I don't know, maths. And it's almost a given that at the age of 13 you're good at maths, so everybody starts focusing in on your ability to do numbers, and by the time you're 25, you've qualified as a mathematician or accountant, and by the time you're 55 you're running a business and you've done nothing but accountancy, because that's what you're specialist at and you know that, but you also daren't step out of that. And I think the way you're talking, I love this idea of actually enabling people to explore what they don't know in a really safe way. So what if, you know, you do an evening, or someone does an evening on teaching people to write poetry or explore poetry or explore, you know, art in a different way. And so what if in many ways what I produce is rubbish? Actually, it's not, because the process is the beauty is in the process, isn't it? It's exactly what you're talking about.
I think there's two things. I think, you know, two aspects to that, which is that one, we are taught to you know, I agree with you, you know, we're taught to specialize, we're taught to focus on our strengths so that we can succeed and achieve. And you know, I don't want to say to a highly skilled artist who's trained and who's honed their skills that that's not great, that's amazing. And I want to celebrate that.
Yeah.
But I would also want to encourage that artist, as you say, to say, well, what about trying something different? You know, you know, when we get to that point of we become safe in our competence, is there time to say, okay, let's throw a random element into this. Let's do something you know, I am going to turn a light on. Can I?
Go on.
Go on.
On you go.
Go through it.
Oh, there he is again.
Oh, look, and there was light. And,
There we
and
go.
God said, oh, look, it's good.
I hope you can edit that out of the podcast.
No, we'll leave that in, Mark. We'll leave that in because we're professionals.
So that's one aspect. I think the other aspect of that, the other side of that is that those who don't specialise in that area don't do it. Because we're taught, no, that's not your thing, that's their thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we've lost some of that element, and I love all the work that's been done over the last 20, 30 years on adult play that says, you know, can we celebrate the play, the process of playing? And I think the story stuff is, you know, I grew up with stories and I grew up with poetry, particular types of poetry, you know, as a kid reciting things like Albert and the Lion and stuff like that. You know, these wonderful narrative kind of colloquial dialect poems and so on. But, you know, by focusing on skill and on people specializing, which I think is fantastic, you know, we then limit the other people's options to do it because we are competitive or comparative. Oh, they're better at that than you, or they're the person that does this. Well, you know, it's not about being better. It's not about that. This is a different, you know, I put a little quote up the other day just to play with on social media to see how people responded, saying, you know, the artist wouldn't say, you know, but what was it? You know, I might make a mess. You know, the artist would say, the mess I make might be beautiful. You know, something like that. I know I've had some interesting dialogue, and it's just one of those little provocative, you know, not really provocative, but put up there for people to think. And it's like, actually, you know, that the willingness to make a mess is part of that process, and it is part of allowing ourselves to let go of competence and say, you know what, I can make a mess of my theology, you know, and that's okay. It's all right for me to get it wrong or to make a mess of it, because in doing so, I might actually encounter something really beautiful and some little kernel that goes and that makes me go, wow, you know, and so I want to encourage people to make a mess. You know, I'm not talking about the sort of, oh, let's just throw stuff around. I'm talking about an intentionality about making a mess, about giving something a go and being willing to be vulnerable, to get dirty and messy, and that what you produce isn't for anybody to look at and go, oh, that's good or that's not good, because that's not the point.
No.
You know, that's really not the point.
I think that's fantastic.
Why are we doing that then, Mark, do you think? Do you know what I mean? That's not the point. What is the point?
You know, it's a good question. And I think there's a lot in our culture that is based on measuring. You know, we want to measure, we want to quantify, and, you know, we want to see, is it good? Is it not good? How can we improve? And there's that sort of process thinking, which is different from engaging in a process. It's the need to succeed, the need to achieve, that's part of our Western culture. The need to be the best or to succeed. I'm quite interested. One of the other philosophies that I'm quite interested in is the African theology of Ubuntu. That sense of we are all one and we exist and engage together. And it's actually, there's something in that which says that, you know, we don't individualize. We all achieve together by engaging, and that's more important. You know, the classic story of the kids in Africa and the Westerner goes out and puts some sweets at the tree, and the kids all line up around the outside, and the person says, well, you know, the first one to the tree gets the sweets, and then he says go, and the kids all join hands and run together. And when they're asked why did they do that, they said, well, if one of us has sweets, all the sweets, that means some of us will have no sweets. And I think, you know, the Western idea is go and get as many sweets as you can.
Yes.
So I think there's something in that our society's become about progress, and become about success and achievement. So we don't like to do things that we don't feel that we can be successful at or we can achieve in. And, you know, and we feel bad about not being able to do something well. It makes us feel bad about ourselves. It's like, it shouldn't make us feel bad about ourselves that we can't do something as professionally or as competently as somebody else, because that's not what it's about. That might be about what some stuff's about, you know, but yeah, I just think it's there in our sort of, our success.
It's interesting. I think we have, all three of us have been part of small groups that have tried to do what you're describing. You made reference to the stuff that we did at Greenbelt. I'd forgotten that was 24 hours. Blimey, that was mad. It was. Yeah, but I suppose that the messy business of community making around art is, I remember how both beautiful and wonderful and dreadful, not because of it not being good in that kind of performance way, just because it's messy and difficult to try and work. You know, we bring our egos to the table, sadly, as well as we're doing all that kind of stuff. So, but actually, in that process, you know, things that emerged from it. Obviously, I didn't remember the 24 hours, but I do remember vividly other things that emerged from that kind of bringing stuff together and making things. And I remember you know, events that we have done, and things that somehow our messy individuality and our limited talents have come together and made something far better than we ever imagined that we could make, which is that's such a privilege to be around that kind of stuff.
One of the things we did during the long worship, which I think actually Proust published as one of the pocket liturgies, the long worship, or the long now, I think it was called, something like that.
Oh yeah.
Which, I don't know if you remember it, Chris, but we one of the things that my community did was in inverted commas, fridge magnet liturgy. And it was such good fun, because what we did was all of our community members wrote their story, their passions, and they told their story, and then we printed that story out word by word, those stories word by words, onto postcards, and then we lay all those postcards on the floor of the venue where we were doing this worship thing, and with sticky tabs on the back of the postcard, so people could stick like the fridge magnets, and they could put these postcards up on the wall and create poetry, liturgy, whatever you want to say. And some of it was hilarious. And then we had, as part of that worship, we were doing the hours. We did the monastic hours through the period, and so we used liturgy from the wall as the liturgy for the hours. And some of the things that came out were hilarious, and some of them were incredibly profound. And we just literally, as we were doing this, we just point to someone and say, turn and read what's in front of you. We had no idea what was going to come up. We had no idea what was going to be put up there, and we had no idea what was going to come out. So you had this like multi-layered of something so simple and so kind of banal in a way. We had this multi-layered that those words came from our stories. So there was something of us in those words. And then people took those words and they put them on the wall and made sentences and poems and stuff with it. And that itself was a layer of poiesis, because they were looking for words and randomly selecting words, or just picking up and then trying to link them together. And then there was this third level that it became part of our corporate worship as we had those, as we rehearsed the hours, the monastic hours through the day. And I love that sense of, there's three layers of the narrative the narratives that dwell in it, because we were investing our stories into it. The individual kind of creative moment, but then somehow it became part of a corporate whole as well. And to me, that captured something, and I loved that. And I've got photos of it that, and I just love that multi-layer that said, you know what, this could be amazing. It could also be ridiculous. And I loved the ridiculousness of it. I remember there was a bit about cowboys. And so in the middle of, I don't know, one of the hours, we're reading this liturgy about cowboys. And it was like, well, so what? You know, I mean, it just...
Exactly that. So what?
It's ridiculous. And I love the ridiculousness of it, you know.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have one more question, I think, which again might take us in all sorts of different directions. But it's thinking about, okay, we've talked a lot about, poesis, about how that might relate to process, how that might relate to event, how that might relate to community. A lot of the stories we've told are from community making and poesis making in the past. What now? What next? How much of that do we carry forward? How much of that feels relevant still, feels important still? How much of it what next? that's my question, I guess.
I think what's next for me, and just looking back a little bit, I think, what the church, what religion has become a kind of association of narrative. We invite people into our narrative. Come and share our story. Come and be part of this story that we are telling. But it's on our terms, in the sense of it's our story. We own the story, and people have to agree or associate with our story. For me, I'm really interested in new story. I'm really interested in how we find narrative together in new ways, in kind of risky ways. I'm interested in can I find narrative with a group of people who, with a pagan, with a guy in prison, with a homeless guy, or with somebody I meet at the football. Can I find narrative together? How do we find a story that talks about our dreams and our desires and our spirituality and our sense of the world that we live in? It's not about finding a single narrative, and it's not about having to all sit down at the end and go, yes, we agree with every word of this. It's about the creative process of making story together that brings together our myths and legends, and brings together our feelings and our emotions and our struggles and our pain and our hopes and our desires. And it's like, actually, can we somehow find that in a way that we can participate together in each other's narratives without feeling, like, oh, that's not my story. Oh, I need to be over here with these people who have the same story as me. So I'm kind of interested in, and I'm interested in big narratives as well. Like, what happens when we as a whole society experience something? What happens when we experience something of wonder? It happened a few months ago when the Northern Lights were, you could see them all over England. And I love that sense that
you're welcome. By the way, we sent you a bone.
Yeah, you did, you really did. And I just love that sense where everybody was like, this is what it's like here, and this is what it's like. Oh, can you see? I've got the same purple here. And it's like, it's a simple thing, but it was a thing of wonder. And as a nation, like, not in an organized, structured way, there was this sort of organic sense of wonder that spread around through social media and through stuff about, wow, look what it looked like in Bath. Wow, it looked like that in Bath. Here's what it looked like in Telford. Wow, to me, that was a thing of real beauty. The thing itself was of beauty, but that wonder, that national sense of of wonder. And then I had people coming up, oh, can we see it in Australia? And I'm like, I don't know. And they're like, oh yeah, we can, look. And it just, I love that sense of the bubbling up of some kind of shared narrative and shared experience and shared wonder. That we all experience it differently, but we're kind of engaging with that same sense of participation in wonder, in the aesthetic, that says, well, here's beauty, but here's my experience of beauty, and oh look, and there's your experience, and you know what I mean? It's kind of hard to capture, but that's what that's where I want to go. I want to go. The divine. I don't own the divine. I don't own God. No. I don't own creation. I don't own wonder. I don't own any of that. And so I want to explore it with you. I want to know how you feel it. I want to know how it makes you tick. I want to know what makes you cry. I want to know what makes you sing, because somewhere in the whole of that, there is this unveiling of the divine, and this unveiling of God who exists in and around and exists, in ways and layers that we can't possibly understand. I don't want to capture God. I want to paint and sing and draw and and speak and rhyme, and because that tells me more about the divine than a theologian trying to capture it in a constructed way.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic.
I'm hearing echoes of the Rumi idea of the kind of us as the reed flute, and the kind of sound that's made through us is almost like the sound that God makes. And just, beautiful. Are you still writing, Mark?
Yeah, I do. Every now and then, I still write. When I decide to sit down and open notes up on my phone and just let the thoughts go. And I'm a visual person, so I describe what I see. I just let my the movie play out in my head, and I describe it. So yeah, I do.
All right, brilliant. I'm always tempted to just read as a poem, Mark, but I haven't prepared you to do that. So we'll get you next time on that one. In fact, I think I'd really like us to do some collective poetry readings on this part of this thing. Anyway, we have talked about doing that. So
yeah,
happy to. Yeah.
Yeah. So have we got somewhere? I think we probably have, haven't we?
I think that's been honestly the bit you just said there, Mark, about exploring story with other people and understanding their story, what makes them tick. I think it's something we've forgotten. We've become all about what's my story. It's about me and my relationship with the divine, or however you want to describe it, and that's what's. Yeah. And actually, no, this is community. We need to live in community, and
I think this is going to be one of those conversations that I go away from and have all sorts of. What about that? What about this? I look forward to listening to this again, and I think I'll be pinging some thoughts and questions and ideas to and fro. In fact, it'd be really nice to do that on the Proust site, so other people can be a part of that as well.
Smashing.
Because one thing that's already beating in my head is the idea of God. Is God the poiesis? Is our poiesis a response to God? There's all sorts of ideas in that. And who is God anyway?
Yes.
But I think it's too big a question for us to answer in this particular chat. So, anything else? Anything else that you two want to add, or are we kind of reached a natural conclusion?
I think this is a great place to stop.
Okay, well, Mark, thank you so much.
Yeah,
you did not disappoint, fella. You did not disappoint. You've been making us scratch our heads for some time.
I do like myself a lot too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what it's all about. Okay, I'm going to press.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to press stop. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.